This is the Tree of Life, Season 6, Chapter 5. In this episode, we will be talking about how structures produce common trait representation necessary for epigenetic convergence and genetic synchronicity. To start out, structures were described as being built on negation or affirmation. Structures are merely conceptual frameworks built upon the affirmation or negation of experiences. Now, as described in the complete series and throughout these podcasts, every social intersection produces an interplay of 9 dialogues of expression, corresponding to the affirmation of 9 impulses. Each dialogue represents an experience channel for expression. When an experience channel meets with negation, the result is a circling back of the experience channel through each social intersection until it produces an affirmational or self-attributed response. In other words, an experience channel is both the mechanism by which an impulse becomes self-conscious, that is, realized, or self-attributed, and is also the self-conscious impulse itself arising out of the other's response to their own impulses. Now, when 2 experiences are synthesized to produce a structure, this is called an affirmational structure. When one experience is used to negate another, this is called a negational structure. Affirmational structures produce experience channels for expression. Negational structures produce dissonant consensualities, being experience channels which negate. Further, a common trait representation is created not by a common structure, but by self-attribution or self-consciousness with respect to a particular impulse. Since every self-conscious impulse represents an affirmational structure, an affirmational structure is a sieve. A negational structure is a filter. Now, a negational structure, just like an affirmational structure, can be passed from one person to another through a conceptual framework. In that, negational structures, while possessing looser associations, can infiltrate the mind just as easily as affirmational structures, which are shared. Whereas affirmational structures permit convergence between distinct structures, negational structures possess a plasticity which allows them to accommodate tighter associational structures. In other words, negational structures tend to infiltrate the edges of a conceptual framework, whereas affirmational structures tend to produce similarity between the independent structures of individual actors. Within an archetypal consensual actor, sublimation, as a manifestation of negation, permits the reworking of an affirmational or archetypal structure. This sublimation typically manifests in response to displacement by a lineal line or a spatial non-consensual actor. In a spatial non-consensual actor, sublimation typically involves the loosening of an archetypal structure, further to its reworking. In other words, sublimation within an archetypal consensual actor permits small adjustments, or fine-tuning of an affirmational structure. Sublimation within a spatial non-consensual actor permits a wholesale reworking of the negational structure, by releasing the tension within that structure, by creating distance between concepts. However, a negational structure, generally, doesn't produce a common trait representation, because it is non-affirmational. It merely erodes the common trait representation represented by an archetypal structure. Nevertheless, it is possible for a negational structure to produce common trait representation as a filter. In other words, rather than producing individualized affirmation to certain self-conscious impulses, a negational structure produces facsimile of a cross-section of a given set of impulses. These impulses produce common reactions of negation within each intersection, generating a common diffraction of negation. Thus, we can see that negational structures have a tendency to unify through opposition, whereas affirmational structures have a tendency to unify through unity. That being said, pure forms of negational structures can be rarely produced without some element of affirmational admixture. To be integrated into the conjoined consensuality requires some comprehensible exploration of the experiences of the conjoined consensuality, which is often only attainable through affirmational structures. Thus, some blending of the two is often necessary to produce a structure which can produce some overlap of trait representation. Thus, it becomes clear that the reason it is necessary to inject new archetypal concepts into this podcast periodically arises out of the need to create a sufficient admixture of affirmational content for the resulting hybrid structure. That's the end of the podcast for today.